Welcome, everyone, to the Responsible Bytes podcast, the podcast where we talk about all things safe and responsible technology. I'm your host, Dr. Zena Assaad, and today I am joined by Branka Marijan, who is a senior researcher at Project Ploughshares in Canada. Welcome to the podcast, Branka.
Thank you so much for having me, Zena. It's a pleasure to join you.
It's so lovely to have you on the podcast. Now, Branka, I asked you to be on the podcast today because at the end of last year, you wrote a policy brief about trust by design for military AI. So can you unpack for me what this concept of trust by design is?
Absolutely. So maybe let me tell you how I came to this idea. I had attended one of the UN discussions on responsible military AI, and there was a lot of talk, especially this is a unitary event. There was a lot of talk about trust, and it came from a panel that had delegates from China and some middle powers. And so what became really clear throughout that panel and other panels over the 2 days is that everyone was talking about trust. We needed countries to trust each other, that they were going to be responsible in their use. We needed to have trustworthy systems from the military side. We needed soldiers to trust systems. And then there was this discussion of there's still a lot of concern about AI applications in society more widely. So trust was this sort of central thing. And I wanted to write about trust, and then I came across this paper, in electronics meant for industry, focused on industry, talking about trust by design. And that paper, I thought, was, talking about all the things we had been talking about at the Convention on Conventional Weapons, at the REAINs on, human agency and responsibility and accountability. And it really nicely started to frame them in ways that sort of highlighted that trust has to be present throughout the life cycle, which is where I think we've sort of landed now in throughout the REAIN discussions. And you have a great paper with Jessica Dorsey on this. That framework, the life cycle of weapon systems really has to take into account responsible design, but it also has to take into account trust. As you sort of build out the various aspects of responsible design, you have to consider how do you ensure that you have trust at that level, so that you're communicating somehow the systems are reliable and can perform well. You have sort of assured reliance there, and you can say you have clear claims and evidence, so that it's that there's data. So that could be internally, there's data that you can verify that in fact that system is performing how you've claimed that it's performing. And then ultimately also there has to be a level of accountability, that there has to be sort of human, oversight or human control at each stage there, so that you can ensure that in fact when people are telling you this has been appropriately tested or this has been verified, that you do have an ability to actually test that and to understand how that has happened, how that decision sort of has been arrived at, that in fact you have to ensure that that trust is verifiable, so that it's not an afterthought. It's not just, a promise someone's making, but in fact you are figuring out a way to, throughout that life cycle, really communicate to everyone that the systems are, trustworthy.
So we've kind of touched on a lot of different concepts with you explaining trust by design, and I want to unpack each of them a little bit more. But I want to start by what is possibly the biggest Pandora's box.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
I've also done research on trust, and I've done it from an engineering perspective.
Yeah.
And I put forward my definition of trust within the context of my research. And one of the things I would always get in return was, well, did you consider this? And, oh, well, did you consider that? And my answer is always, of course I did. But at some point, if you're going to try and put something into practice, you need to put boundaries around it, right? We can't have this ambiguous, amorphous thing and then try and develop a framework around it or try and put it into practice. And so I put forward this definition of trust. So I'm very curious if you have gone so far as to put forward a very clear definition of trust, and then what that definition is and what the responses were to it, because it really is a very multifaceted concept that means different things in different disciplines.
Absolutely. And, in international relations, which I'm, a student of, we're always sort of very worried about concept stretching, right? Are you stretching this concept beyond sort of recognition? And I do feel like trust is one of those terms that we all kind of have a sense of, like, we know when we don't trust someone, but we don't maybe know quite to describe why we have this level of distrust. But the way I sort of thought about it is really operationalizing trust, right? So that sense that we all have, that we can rely on something, is certainly a part of it. Sort of understanding trust is, you can rely on something, so it will perform how you were told it's going to perform. And then when you actually use it, it actually does that. And that's where I think it nicely fits into that life cycle discussion, because it's really speaking about very practical understandings of trust. There's also a level of understanding of trust given the subject matter, which is trust among states, which, if you think about where is there little trust, it is in international security among states. Like, they're not, it's not just this sort of gut feeling that they have trusting each other. We get this term from arms control, which is trust but verify, precisely because there is an acknowledgement that there is a lot of distrust. So in order to address that, I think that's where I was thinking through, and I'm going to expand on this, how do we sort of operationalize it even more? But in the sort of the policy brief, I started putting my feet into the water a little bit to say, I think there's different levels here, right? So we have to have confidence in the tools so that they're reliable, predictable, technically sound. And that's like a more technical sort of aspect, right? But then I sort of like, it's not enough just to have that technical, technical assurance. You actually also need this sort of fuzzier understanding of trust that maybe comes from international relations, which is about
I love that you use the words fuzzy to describe it.
Well, because so much of international relations, when you're studying it, everyone says, like, we live, in this state of anarchy, and there is no, there is no hegemon ultimately, but there's nobody in charge, kind of thing. So we're all so reliant on each other. We're so interdependent. And I think that's sometimes what doesn't come through the discussions on military AI and this new technology in the security space, is that we are so interdependent, whether we're thinking technically through supply chains, or whether we're thinking through like the implications. So that's why we have these dialogues, because countries do at the end of the day understand that if a system if there's errors that are created by system, if a system is not controlled, it is going to have effects on them and their security. So this is why we get, people often say, well, why would you, participate in some of these processes? But because you're interdependent, and you know that, and you might not, you might not truly believe that some of these countries are going to follow all the rules, but having sort of the rules of the road helps everyone. And that's ultimately, I think, what I was trying to think through. Like, how do you then get these countries who distrust each other to work together to build a level of trust at that multilateral level, so that we can have systems that that can be used. And some of these systems are going to be incredibly helpful, but some of them could be quite problematic. So how do we sort of draw the boundaries to say, okay, this is how you're going to now let us know that you are deploying technology responsibly, and that you're upholding the international commitments, that you're respecting the laws of war, and so there is the state level, there's sort of the basic technological system level. There is also, for militaries, a really important sort of set of assurances that they need to have before they deploy technology, which is, a military context is incredibly sort of acute context for deployments of these technologies. So we need to ensure that whether it's training, whether it's oversight, right, whether it's, doctrine, that they're also thinking about, like, how are they incorporating trust there? Because, militaries also have seen that, some soldiers perhaps are a little bit skeptical of some of the systems that they want to be deploying. And so they have to think about that as well. And then, of course, in democratic societies, different societies have sort of different expectations. But in democratic societies, we expect our military to be a responsible actor. And if they are not a responsible actor in a democratic society, they will hear about it. There will be consequences to that. So I think that's sort of where, I think it's in the interest of the military to say, no, we're doing this responsibly and we're being a responsible actor. And we are thinking through escalation dynamics, and we are thinking through, the need to have humans who feel empowered using this technology and who've been appropriately trained for it. So those are all these aspects that we think we talk about in precisely the life cycle.
Then I want to touch on this interdependence point a little bit. You made
Yeah.
the correct point that we are very interdependent, in particular when it comes to supply chains for the development of these technologies. But something that we're seeing in China and the US particularly are decisions around sovereignty and around sovereign capabilities. And both China and the US are trying to localize their supply chains. So what does that do to that relationship of trust between nations? And does fracturing that interdependence impact trust?
Yeah, I think, in Canada, we have this now existential crisis. What does it mean to be a middle power? Like, what
Yeah.
should we do? We need to do something, but what should
What
we
is our
do?
role now?
What is our role in the world now? And we're in a particular situation because we were just used to riding in the back seat, and sort of letting others drive. And now we're like, okay,
Which
now
is not really the case anymore, right? With the state
abs-
of the world, it's going to be very dangerous to kind of ride in the back seat and just let somebody else drive and direct.
Absolutely. And we're all sort of waking up to this new reality of like, okay, we need to actually maybe have access to those supply chains. And it matters far beyond what we're realizing in Canada, and I'm sure in Australia, other places as well, is that we need to have we need to ensure that we have access to those supply chains, not just for the military, but also for our small and medium, businesses and enterprises, because they're the vast majority of our economic health is in those kinds of businesses. And so I think what's become really clear is that though there's a sort of fracturing in this, this sort of wish on part of the United States and China, which certainly, they can exercise a much greater deal of sovereignty over technology than we can, right? It is the US companies, the five that have the most of the world's compute power, if we're talking about realities, like these are realities we have to face. But there is another thing where I don't know if it's fully appreciated. The great powers also need the middle powers in smaller countries. And that's precisely in this multilateral space to develop these rules and regulations, because it's not in their interests either to have systems which are being developed, which are unpredictable, or which can cause all sorts of problems for them, right? Because though they can sort of make their supply chains interdependent, we are ultimately, at the end of the day, so tied together globally.
You're saying that they need middle powers in order to develop regulations for these systems because, as you said, having unpredictable systems or systems that really lack technical integrity is not in their interest. However, what we have seen from the US in particular is this huge anti-regulation stance. I mean, the most recent one is the public dispute between the US Department of Defense and Anthropic, right? Anthropic want to put in some safety guardrails on Claude, and the US Department of Defense are like, absolutely not. We want to use it however we want to use it.
Yeah.
So I agree with you that we need regulation and that middle powers can play a significant role in that. But how do we get the bigger players to actually understand and appreciate the role of middle powers in regulation when they don't want regulation?
Yeah, absolutely. Well, I think this is sort of like they want to have their cake and eat it too, right? They want to say, we don't want regulation. We're going to do whatever we want. And in the case of Anthropic in the United States, I mean, really, like, you have to wonder, like, where is the democratic oversight? Like, where are your democratic institutions? This should not be a debate between, CEO's ethical perspectives and his company's views and, the Department of War now, right? The Pentagon there should not be a debate between them. This is very much a discussion where you're seeing what lack of regulation actually leads to is this kind of like ad hoc governance. And that's not good for anyone, right? Because a new administration could come in with vastly different views, right? And they could completely undo what the previous administration has done. So, and which is, I mean, a bit what's happening. We didn't have the rules and we didn't have this clear. And now Congress isn't really controlling that narrative. It's, the sort of public fight between these different institutions, but they want to eat their cake too because they want to do whatever they want to do with their companies. And this is similar to China, right? But at the same time, they understand, even if they are not going to, I think, say this publicly or be there publicly much, they need these other countries to kind of develop the rules of the road that then they can kind of decide what to do with, ultimately, because they have the technological power. But when you're a middle power, you're kind of stuck, because if there are no rules of the road, you really are, you're in the thick of the fog of war. You have no understanding of what anyone could do. If you have allies, like Canada, for example, has to worry about interoperability. It's not going to go do anything alone. So if your systems don't work well with other systems, if those systems can be manipulated, if there are vulnerabilities, right? If there are cyber vulnerabilities, if all of these things are concerns that the middle powers, do really have to step up and do, because whatever is happening with the US administration for the moment might be different in a few years' time. And I think China is interesting, right? They've kind of played both sides of, we need some agreement at the international, we need some regulation, but not too much. But ultimately, at the end of the day, and I really truly believe that they do want these other countries to do the groundwork a bit of setting up this system. And then they'll do what great powers can always do, which is make it work for them. But, if you're a smaller power, you really don't have much of a choice except to try and put some guardrails in place so that it's not completely, completely sort of lacking in rules, that the space that you're entering actually has some sense of an order that can be relied upon.
And I think we're seeing a shift in that, right? So we've seen some of the smaller powers across Europe are no longer using Microsoft-based products. They're turning to more sovereign-based products. So we are kind of seeing, I don't think it's a shift in power, but I think what we're seeing is a shift in compliance, maybe. So up until now, those 5 big tech companies have been so dominant, and it has been by default, really, that we have used their products. And so we are seeing a shift in smaller powers kind of utilizing their autonomy in their decision making to say, actually, we don't agree with the way that this is going, and these are the decisions that we can make. And I do think that it's the accumulation of those iterative kind of decisions that does enforce change over time.
Absolutely. And I think some countries have been really great at this. Like, whenever I speak to Canadian diplomats, I'm like, we need to be more like the Dutch. And the Netherlands really recognized very, I think, early on that this is an important place to become a player and to shape dialogue. And I think what we are seeing a bit is a bit of a competition to set the rules, and who gets to set the rules and which middle power gets to be a player, right? And I think that speaks to that recognition that, we actually, over time, this will matter. And so we need to put some effort and capacity towards this. And I think that's very healthy, actually, because I do think that it's important for these smaller countries to understand what a profound shift some of this technology is going to bring to, international security, and how are they going to respond. So the Dutch are one example, but, you can think of Singapore, you can think of all these other countries that have been really great on responsible military AI, but also on cyber, doing very practical things. Like, I was speaking to someone about this, Dr. Paul Meyer in Canada, and he was talking about Singapore, the way in which in the cyber discussions, they had very practical things, such as pulling together a directory of people so that you knew who to contact. And not only did they pull together this directory of people responsible in different departments, but they also went and checked it. They called, they called the diplomats, they called the Department of Defense people to make sure that the numbers work and that the lines are open. And so that's the kind of work some of these smaller countries, if they're kind of struggling, what's their role in this, if they don't feel as empowered, they can do that kind of work, and that will help them have a seat at the table. And I think that ultimately matters too.
And it's a trusted seat, right? Going back to this concept of trust,
Yes,
it is a
absolutely.
trusted seat. So I think we could comfortably argue that Singapore would be deemed a a trusted middle or smaller power. And I think that's an important part as well, to not only have a seat at the table, but to have a trusted and recognized seat at the table. And doing that work internally is really what builds towards that international multilateral trust.
Absolutely. Investing in capacity,
Mm.
I think countries like Canada, for example, just because it's the easier example for me to use, are small big powers, small middle powers, sorry, because they haven't really exercised their power in some of the space. So they don't have the capacity necessarily that they should have, but they're building up that capacity. And that comes from very much that recognition of you are a trusted voice, or you could be a trusted voice in this space. And having that legitimacy comes from really investing in capacity so that you do train, whether it's the foreign affairs staff or whether it's the individuals in the Department of National Defense, to translate a bit between these worlds, right? To translate between the technical world and the governance world. And we really need translators. We need people who understand the technical aspects, who understand the policy discussions, because I think that's where some of the geopolitical dynamics really come into play. Because some things, and nothing against lawyers, but lawyers think like if we just perfect the language, and I always think in this discussion, I'm like, I'm sure we have so many bright minds. If we got them together in one room, they could have this solved by tomorrow legally, but that's not the problem. The politics is the problem, and the lack of political will, right, to set some strong rules in place. So acknowledging that we are in this turbulent time geopolitically is important for all of us. But then to say, okay, what can be done? We recognize this is a challenging time. What can be done within this space and within this time to create that, whether it's trust or whether it's that sort of responsibility that we'd like to see with the use of these technologies?
And I would argue that the ambiguity around these technologies kind of feeds into that as well, right? The way that they're portrayed and the way that they're put forward as being so sophisticated that we could never understand them. I think that really plays into weaving around the problem. And you were saying before about the need for different disciplines. So obviously my background is in engineering, and I come at this from a very technical perspective, but I spend a lot of time trying to explain how certain interventions that people are recommending just would not be technically feasible. And so marrying that technical and non-technical perspective is actually really hard. The technical and non-technical side don't always balance each other out very well. So when we're
No.
thinking about this from a trust perspective, how do you find that balance between different disciplines that don't always meet in the middle?
I think this is why we have to have those translators and have to have those people who are, who understand the technical sort of aspects, but then who also understand some of the geopolitical dynamics so that it can really be a dialogue. And I think people like you are so in demand everywhere, right? Like you just general discussions on
My job is
AI.
currently recession proof
Absolutely. Mine
for the
less
time
so,
being.
but mine less so. But I think what I've found over the years, our offices are at the University of Waterloo. So part of the reason why I got involved in this discussion in 2015 was because of some presentations I attended at the University of Waterloo, which were very technical. And then but I thought I could understand them. Like I could understand where they were going or what they were discussing, and I could see the problems on the geopolitical side and the political side. And so I think that's where, when we are thinking about trust, we have to, in this space in particular, we have to grab the different strands and we have to weave it into something that's actually practical and useful to all of us, right? And I very much empathize with the engineers who, for years have listened to discussions on autonomous weapons and things and say that could just not, like, that can't be done, or that would not happen like that. And the military has the same perspective. The militaries will say, well, we would never have something out of the chain of command. But then I think what's been helpful is the technical experts will say, well, but you can, we can nudge your decision making, right? And that's where the technical experts are really important, because they come, for example, I'm a big fan of systems design. Systems design engineers at the University of Waterloo are absolutely, I think, the top students because of the way they approach these sort of societal implications and other applications. And that's been really incredibly important. So I think we need to bring these people together. in this discussion, in this space, and say, in this particular context, how does this apply? And there are useful things that are happening in the discussions on autonomous vehicles. But I always find the autonomous vehicles example a little bit limited in terms of what we're talking about, precisely because I think the context is different. Some of the risks are very, are very heightened. I mean, in the military context, the military space, you have rules of the roads for roads already. Like if you drive in Canada, you wouldn't think so, but the rules are there, even if people aren't very good at following a lot of them. But it's clearer for a robot to follow those rules, essentially. Whereas in the space that we're functioning, there are certain rules, but a lot of it is contextual judgments that we've depended on. And now it's thinking about how do you solve that, from a technical perspective, that also is something that we would support from a governance perspective and, an ethical perspective and a legal perspective. So I think that's where that multi-layered understanding of trust is important, but ultimately one that will have to be contextualized. And I think the lesson from arms control and diplomacy that I've certainly learned studying some of them over the years is that ultimately, at the end of the day, for a lot of processes, everyone is a bit unhappy, right? Like the civil society wanted stronger rules. The legal experts maybe wanted different language. Governments maybe wanted certain restrictions or put in certain sort of clauses to exit out of the treaties. So, everyone's a bit unhappy. But I think if we can reach that level of consensus that allows us to not be surprised by things and not have catastrophic outcomes and not have humanitarian crisis after humanitarian crisis, like that will be success. And I think when we're thinking sometimes about this technology, we want, and like the diplomatic response to it, we want like 100%, right? And we're not going to get 100%. We're going to get to somewhere, I think, that is sufficient enough for everyone. But even getting to that and getting that understanding requires that more people who are technical experts and others become involved in the discussion so that they're grounded in reality, so that we're not trying to figure out like how do you actually do this on the technical side that we've been signed up to do.
And I think it's also about acknowledging that not everything has a technical solution. So I know, at least in the last current couple of years, we've had this kind of narrative of AI solutions, and there's like an AI solution to every problem. But the reality is that there are a lot of aspects of warfare that don't have technical solutions. They just don't. So, the principle of proportionality is one of them. It doesn't have a technical solution. It requires context appropriate human judgment. It does not have a technical solution. And some people will argue that it does, but it simply doesn't. And so I think acknowledging that not everything has a technical solution and then what non-technical interventions you have to put in place is a really important factor as well. We've kind of been blinded a little bit with AI and autonomous systems as being this kind of all-encompassing military capability that we just have to use and we have to employ. But there are a lot of contexts in which we shouldn't, and we don't have to. And I think that kind of pragmatic discussion has been lost in the waters a little bit.
Absolutely. I think that's sort of the realities of warfare, I think, are such that, this idea that you would have techno-solutionism, you just have to look back. Yes, technology has allowed at certain times certain militaries to be much more successful, but we've also seen quite technologically advanced militaries not be very successful in more recent conflicts too. And so if we think technology is going to solve all of this, I think we're going to be greatly disappointed if that's the belief. And then there's something to be said about, because I'm someone who came to the subject matter from studying post-conflict societies. And I have to say, I got a little burned out studying these societies because you're stuck in a vicious cycle. It's really difficult to rebuild, okay? We're very good at killing each other. We're not very good at rebuilding societies. It takes decades, it takes generations, and we're still struggling. And so I think when we are, thinking about some of this technology, I always think about what's the incentive to cease hostilities? Like, what's the incentive to ensure that you are not ruining these societies beyond recognition so that they cannot rebuild? And ultimately, like, who does the rebuilding, right? And it's always like the humanitarians and others who are left with sort of the mess that's been created. So I think with this technology, what we have an opportunity to do, if we have the foresight to do it, is really to think about that. Like, think about this prior to some major, uses of this technology in different contexts, where we cannot fix things really well. It's really challenging, and I think human societies or cultures, they're so dynamic and they're so fluid. I also wouldn't want, and I like, I come from Bosnia, and I'm like, I wouldn't want someone in Bosnia to be categorized as a certain ethnicity by some AI system when their own understanding of who they are, it's much more dynamic and it's much more layered, and you're not just your ethnicity as well, right? So I think that's where I really struggle sometimes in these discussions, because that's never brought up. Like, how do you like rebuild some of these countries, and is that even a thought in sort of when we're thinking about the future of warfare? I think we're too blinded by the shiny technical things, and then we forget about how difficult it is in a lot of places around the world to actually survive these conflicts. Decades after peace agreements are signed, they still are struggling. And I don't think we get that nuance, and maybe we're going to get there, but I do approach the subject matter very much from that position of, I've seen how difficult it is to be in these societies during war. I've seen how difficult it is to try and rebuild them, even when you have so much support. And so what are we doing here about transforming warfare that we're missing out maybe on? Like, how can we ensure that we have sort of these rules thought about much earlier on? And those are not technical questions, right? Those are very much maybe philosophical or political questions that we have to consider and really inform society about. And particularly in the Western world, I think we've been in a little bit of a bubble, and there's so many crises happening all around the world where those people don't have the same privilege that we have to be removed from those concerns and those kinds of questions.
I think that's a really salient point, especially given the nature of AI-enabled systems, right? They are data-based, and people do get brought down to something as small as a data point, right? And how people are represented within these technologies is really dehumanizing. And we're seeing that in Gaza, aren't we? So, the IDF have used these technologies for huge surveillance of Palestinians, and the decisions that are made for these human beings based on how they're represented as a data point is incredibly dehumanizing and inhumane. And while I agree with you that there are very long-term effects of conflict, so my family's Lebanese, my dad lived through quite a few of the wars in Lebanon, so
Yeah.
I've experienced that. I don't think we are fully going to see the long-term impacts
Yeah.
of AI-enabled warfare for quite some time. And
Yeah.
that, I think, is going to be a really difficult question to answer. We have a lot of information about the long-term impacts of conflict, although I don't believe that we've addressed all of those problems.
Yeah.
But I think we are still going to continue to see what the long-term impact is of AI-enabled conflict and what that does to a group of people. And it really
Absolutely.
is disheartening. And I don't have an answer for it. And I know
Yeah, I
it's
know.
not a positive point of discussion, but it
Yeah.
is really important to have, right? Like, what are the long-term impacts for a community like the Palestinian people from a digitally enabled conflict in which they were all reduced to a mere data point, and decisions on their life and the quality of their life were made based on numerical values? It's a huge question.
Absolutely. And I think that sort of, kind of considering them even initially, I think is important, because like, what is this path we're on? Is important for militaries to consider. Like, why do you need a certain capability? What does it do that your existing systems don't do? And I think a lot of countries, like when you push them to that, they're not clear. They don't want to fall behind, right? They don't want to be technically
Fall
disadvantaged.
behind what?
Yes.
So this is
Is it-
always my gripe. They always talk about we don't want to fall behind. What are you falling behind? What is the current gap in your military capabilities that this wonderful elusive technology that doesn't actually work that great is somehow miraculously going to fill? And no one can ever answer that question.
No, they can't. And but this sort of hypothetical, this idea that they're going to fall behind,
Yes.
or that if you talk about regulation and governance, you're somehow wanting to constrain your military. And in the U.S.,
Constrain innovation.
yeah, exactly. And this narrative emerged in the U.S. I remember around Project Maven and Google, which was like, if you're not so committed to this, you're unpatriotic. And I'm like, what a categorization to make for people to say that someone's unpatriotic just because they think there should be clear rules and clear regulations. And that shuts down dialogue and ultimately, I think, makes us all much poorer in this space. And that's what I think. I'm hopeful that because militaries do want to be responsible actors, that they're going to consider some of these questions.
So then in your policy brief, you kind of touch a little bit on confidence building measures as a
Yeah.
mechanism for enabling trust. So can
Yeah.
you unpack for me maybe a little bit what those confidence building measures could look like and how effective they could be in the context of AI enabled military systems?
Absolutely. So recognizing sort of the geopolitical moment we're in, I think there's been a lot of great work done on confidence building measures, Unidir and by Mike Horowitz and others. And I really do think it matters a lot for this trust piece, because what we're sort of, we recognize there aren't technical solutions to some aspects of this trust, right? Once you've done sort of the technical assurance, like how do you then create that trust between the different actors? And that's where confidence building measures really are important, to maintain a level of stability, a level of order. And that could be, something like incident notification protocols, which have been discussed, some sort of verification measures. And they don't have to be super specific, because in this space, and international security, national security, we're always running up against this being able to share information without oversharing, national secrecy. So, but we've done this before, right? We've done this. I'll admit it was a lot easier, for example, on nuclear weapons, where you can, so count them, see them. It's much harder to do on
They
cyber.
were
It's
more
much harder
tangible.
and more tangible. Like, it's much harder to do on cyber. It's much harder to do with AI and autonomous weapons. So recognizing that, it's about thinking like, how do we sort of propose, what are the toolkits, and we see a lot of great work being done on this, sort of that we have shared knowledge and shared understanding amongst various states, that there's a shared language, and then ultimately having these opportunities for states to disclose a bit, maybe about certain systems or how they're thinking about certain issues, and how they would solve for them. I do think um, all of them will come up with some of the technical challenges which exist, which you sort of point to, right? Like, there's brittleness, there's unpredictability, there's emergent behavior, there's all sorts of technical things which are going to be of interest across the board. So it's finding initiatives that will allow states really to develop common or shared standards a bit as well, for that will be a part of that wholesale sort of confidence building measure. And then looking for that policy, in policy we talk about like, what's the policy window in which you can now strengthen that from just mere dialogue. But I do think this is where like track 1.5 dialogue could be
Mhm.
incredibly important, right? Where you could have academics, which you mean everyone's already doing this, right? You have this paper with Jessica and Ingeveld and others who are all doing really great work to push forward ideas and understandings of the issues, which I think are very much appreciated, particularly in smaller states that might not have the capacity, that might not have the ability to necessarily maybe lead on this. And this is where all of these other actors from civil society and civil society organizations can really build up that knowledge, so that when that policy window opens, when we're hopefully in a bit of a better geopolitical moment, we can have, maybe a more formal discussion among states, more formal mechanisms for that. Because ultimately what the states are going to discover, I think, with this technology is that they'll want to have some verification approaches, or at least some opportunity to exchange information. I talked about
Mhm.
Singapore and cyber and crisis hotlines. Like, these are very practical things. They're not the flashy things, but they're the things that keep international security going. So even though I agree with a lot with what our Prime Minister Mark Carney said, at Davos about the rupture in the international system, I do think there's a bit of an underappreciation of some of the sort of the piping, of international security governance that allows things to flow and that allows us to have a level of stability so that we know when we got on a plane that hopefully, we're safe, that we know that these rules and mechanisms are all still in place. And that's the sort of the background work that the confidence building measures can do for us that will make us so much safer. And that will ultimately help in this sort of what appears to be like the sped up time of AI hype and development, that kind of groundwork can be laid out, and that those structures really will be ones that then will have firm foundations and firm support.
So I think then this is the perfect segue into our last question, which is the question that I ask all of my guests.
Yeah.
And it is, what is one piece of advice you have for people for engaging with technology safely and responsibly? So what is your one responsible bite?
My responsible bite is I think we should be enthusiastic about technology, but also skeptical. We should be aware of the various biases we have with technology, whether it's, automation bias, our overtrust of technology, our, just sort of wanting to act and do all sorts of things. I think that sort of healthy skepticism is really important. And I know this is not a sound bite, but I always think of Stanislav Petrov, and in the 80s, right? I think the New York Times called him the man who saved the world by doing nothing. But it's not that he didn't do anything. He
What
talked
an
about
amazing
his
catchphrase.
yeah, he did something really important, which is he said he trusted his gut instinct that this early warning system that was indicating that the United States had attacked the Soviet Union at that time was inaccurate. And I've since broken down his gut instinct to two things. One, he worked on those early warning systems. He knew they were rushed, so he had the technical understanding. And then the second point is he used his judgment about the fact that the United States would not just attack the Soviet Union at that time with 5 missiles, right? They would send all their might. And so I think that's sort of like, we need people to have that educated gut instinct whenever they're using technology. So they need to have those two aspects. They need to have some technical understanding, and then they need to have a broader understanding of the context in which they're using that technology.
That's a really wonderful place to end this episode on.
Thank you so
Branka, you
much,
have
Jen.
been incredible to talk to. Thank you so much for being on the podcast today.
Thank you so much for having me.
And for all of our listeners, I will leave links to where you can find Branka and to her policy brief in the description. But thank you again, Branka.
Thank you.